I said everything gonna be alright. I said everything will be alright.
Everything's going to be all right. Good day wherever you're listening from, and welcome to Indoor Air Quality Radio, IAQ Radio. It's Friday, February 12th, 2016. We're up to episode 401. My name is Radio Joe Hughes. I think here with me in the studio is our engineer, John. You gotta have faith. All right, this week we're going to do a little thing called Radio Joe Reports from the Particulate Matter workshop at the National Academy of Sciences. It was very good. I'm going to try and summarize in an hour the things that occurred over a day and a half. Before we get started, let's thank our marquee sponsors. And thanks to our newest sponsor, Particles Plus. Particles Plus engineers and manufactures feature-rich particle counters, air quality monitoring instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. Learn more at www.particlesplus.com. Count on us.
John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com.
CleanFacts, the number one information source for cleaning and restoration professionals. Check them out at cleanfactswithanx.com.
IAQ.net and Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at IAQ.net. Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their products or services.
Particle man, doing the things a particle can. What's he like? It's not important. Particle man, is he a dot or is he a speck? When he's underwater, does he get wet? Or does the water get him instead? Nobody knows. Particle man.
All right, let's get started. So I just got back. I was at the workshop on the health risks of indoor exposure to particulate matter. This was a program put together by the National Academy of Science. It was sponsored by EPA, and it was excellent. Had a very good time and saw a bunch of excellent speakers. I'm going to jump right into it because I'm not sure where the Z-Man is, but we're going to jump in here without him. The chair, I guess, I'll have to get the correct terminology on this, was Bill Nazaroff. Bill is pretty well known in the industry. We're going to get Bill on, too, by the way. It was great to have a lot of the people who spoke here were actually past guests of the show, which was nice to see, but there were a few we haven't gotten yet, including Mr. Nazaroff. He is the Daniel Tellep Distinguished Professor of Engineering at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. And he did a real nice job of pulling people together and then coordinating the entire event. Other members who contributed were Terry Brennan, Dr. Rich Coursey, who we've had on the show. Terry, of course, we've had. Dr. Howard Kipen, who was excellent as well in coordinating some very good presentations. And Tina Raponen, who I hope we're going to get from the University of Cincinnati, where I did finally get a chance to meet and talk to her. And we're going to bring her on real soon. So I guess the first thing I want to mention is a little background before we get started. The task at hand was they put together an ad hoc committee for a 1.5 day, a day and a half public workshop on the state of science regarding the health effects of indoor exposure to particulate matter. It was planned and organized a workshop. They selected and invited speakers, and they broke it into several different, I guess, major categories, I want to say. The categories were, we started out with the sources of indoor particulate matter. That was moderated by Bill Nazaroff. We had Brent Stevens, Lin Hi Roman, and Brandon Bohr speak on that topic. And then they had particulate dynamics and chemistry. That was moderated by Rich Coursey. Glenn Morrison, Jeff Siegel, and Charlie Weschler spoke there. Then we had exposure levels and characterization. That one was moderated by Terry Brennan. We had Barbara Turpin, Dr. Turpin, Dr. Roy Harrison, and Gary Adamkowitz. Get it right, Gary. And then we had exposure mitigation. That was Bill Fisk, Sergey Greenspun, and Brett Singer. And finally, we had identified and emerging health concerns. That was a very good session. Bill Nazaroff did a welcome on that. That was moderated by Dr. Kuipen, Ryan Allen, David Rich, and Mark Weisskopf spoke during that session. And the final session, which was very interesting, was intervention and risk communication. And that was Dr. George Gray, Dr. Bill Hallman, and Dr. Leanne Kohler. A lot of PhDs in the room. I don't think I'd ever been in a room with so many PhDs in my life. Well organized. We had a good group of people in the room, but also about 400 people were following on the webinar that was being done live from the event. They had both audio and video. A lot of good questions from all around. Let's see do we have the Z-Man?
Win a cool prize by outcompeting fellow IAQ radio listeners and being the first person to correctly answer the IAQ radio trivia question each week. Submitting your answer is easy. Either email it to czlotnick@cs.com, or if you're listening to the show live, you can text in the answer via your computer. I'm happy to report we had a photo finish and have two winners for last week's trivia question. Andrew Conzer, president and owner of Certified Safety Consulting in St. Louis, Missouri, and John Lapotere, Indoor Air Quality Solutions, Winter Springs, Florida. The IQ Radio Trivia question for Friday, February 12, 2016, has been sponsored by Triska, the Restoration and Specialty Cleaners Association, who have been serving the needs of and advocating for their members for over 30 years. Remember, Triska is your link to industry training, certification, standards, and events. Check out their website. It's trsca.org. Now for this week's trivia question. What is the smallest unit of matter? Back to you, Joe.
Interesting. All right. Now, to get a little more background, since this was all about particulate matter, I want to just get a little background on what particulate matter is. According to EPA, particulate matter, also known as particulate pollution, oftentimes referred to as PM, is a complex mixture of extremely small particles and liquid droplets. Particle pollution is made up of a number of components, including acids, organic chemicals, metals, and soil or dust particles. And the size of particles is directly linked to their potential for causing health problems, and EPA is concerned about particles that are 10 micrometers in diameter or smaller, because those are the particles that generally pass through the throat, nose, and enter the lungs. Once inhaled, these particles can affect the heart, lungs, and cause serious health effects. And actually, they're more concerned now about the PM 2.5 and smaller. Those we call the inhalable coarse particles. And then we have the inhalable coarse particles are the 10 micrometer and smaller. Then we go the 2.5 micrometer and smaller. Those are called fine particles. And then ultrafine particles, which are a fairly recent area of discussion in the indoor air quality world, are 100 nanometers in diameter, it would be, or smaller. So these are very small particles, about 0.1 micrometers and smaller. I think most of the people in the IAQ world are using like a particle counter from like our sponsor, Particles Plus. They've got particle counters that go down to about 0.3 micrometers. They probably capture some of that, but to get these really small ones, you need an ultrafine particle counter, which is a different way of measuring and a little more expensive. We'll talk about that as we go along as well. All right, so Cliff.
Okay, Joe. What was the format? Well, first of all, how was the food? Was the food good?
Yeah, it wasn't bad. I mean, actually, that's a good point. The Sloan Foundation was there, and they had paid for some, little food, beverages, the coffee break, and a little breakfast, etc. So, and then the breaks. So that was nice. We had to go eat at the cafeteria, which was no problem.
All right, well, what was the format and where was the workshop held?
Interesting place, the National Academy of Sciences in D.C., northwest quadrant of D.C., and we had a nice conference room there with a spillover room, and they had good audio-video equipment there, and we're broadcasting to about 400 people online. I think around the world, actually. I know at least around the United States. But it was a nice facility. They had it set up in sections, which I talked about before you got on, so I'm not going to review that. And we had presentations from each of the section leaders, and then a presentation. They had 3 different presentations within each section.
All right. Why do you think the EPA chose to put so much effort behind a particulate matter and health workshop program?
Well, Dave Ralston of EPA was the first speaker. He, after Bill Nazaroff introduced and welcomed everybody, they had Dave Ralston on from EPA, and he talked about EPA's taking a holistic approach to indoor air quality, and then using the results of this particular conference to help inform the work that EPA does in the future. And as most of our listeners know, the biggest component of indoor air quality related issues is somehow related to particles and particulate matter. And of course, EPA also has the ambient air exposure that they deal with outside air, and a big component of the indoor air comes from outside. They're also well aware that there are specific health concerns with respect to PM 2.5 particles, and so it's an issue that is a huge part of the indoor air quality world.
Who attended the live event, and then who participated online?
Well, I went over the people that were there live, although there were others. There were several people from the National Institutes of Standard and Technology. The people from the National Academy of Science were there. David Butler was the staff member from NAS that organized everything, did a great job. Guru Madhavan was there as well. He helped with the organization of things. Anna Martin. There were people from the Environmental Protection Agency, Laura Kolb, I mentioned Dave Ralston, and then we had all kinds of different industry participants, and a lot of them were people doing research on indoor air quality related issues, a lot of PhDs, a lot of professors, and from all over the country. A couple even had to call in. They couldn't make it live. We had one gentleman also called in from the United Kingdom. So it was an excellent group of people. Actually, Cliff, you'd have been proud of us. I would say about half of the speakers have been on the show at one point or another.
That's great. That's great. Well, do you want to go through the presentations one by one and comment on them?
Yeah, let's do that. I think what I did is I took notes with every presentation, and I started, of course, with Dave Ralston and his presentation, and then I went on to Brent Stevens was next. We had Brent Stevens, who was talking about outdoor air and appliances as sources of indoor particulate matter. And Dr. Stevens has been on the show. He's with the Illinois Institute of Technology. I encourage listeners to go back and check out his show if they get a chance. He was saying that a 2005 report study indicated that about 130,000 deaths are attributed to elevated outdoor PM 2.5. This was a 2005 study. I don't know if he had any more current numbers on that, but that's a big number when you think about it. And we've got a lot of people that are, having mostly respiratory and cardiovascular issues as a result of exposure to this PM 2.5 outdoors. Well, it only goes to makes sense that indoor levels oftentimes are higher than outdoors, and so there's concern about what the indoor PM 2.5 will do. They talked about the fact that people spend about 90% of their time indoors. Brent also talked about the indoor-outdoor ratio of particles and what he called the infiltration ratio. And he did a great job of discussing that on our show. I've heard numbers between, it depends on the size of particles, so the ultrafine particles get indoors a little less frequently than the fine particles, and the coarse particles are also sort of like the ultrafine. So the fine particles tend to be the ones that get indoors in the largest numbers, probably about 80%, somewhere in that range. And overall, all the particles about 50 to 80%. And one of the things that Brent was emphasizing, and all the speakers were emphasizing, is what we do not know. So first they told us what we know. Brent discussed how the building envelope works as a filter essentially, and that a lot of particles, about 50 to 80%, make it through that envelope, but it depends on the type of envelope you have as well. And what we don't know is things like variabilities in infiltration and air exchange rates, and how window opening frequencies impact air exchange rates, and how air exchange rates vary with window opening. It could be 2 to 4 times higher, but there's no good data on that. And then he also discussed a little bit about the underlying mechanisms that govern the factors of infiltration, like the envelope I mentioned earlier. And finally, he brought up a couple of newer sources, I guess, one of them being 3D printing. And they've done a little work on what 3D printing does, and it emits huge numbers of particles. And finally, I want to mention that Brent also brought up heated surfaces. This is something I never really thought that much about in our indoor and we do indoor air quality investigations, and I guess you always intuitively realize that heated surfaces would cause an increase in particulate, but heated surfaces and ultrafine particles were something that we need to learn more about, and he talked about that. And my first thought was, well, I guess I got to go around and clean all those little baseboard heaters I've got in the house, and get the fins cleaned out and all that, because we just don't know how much that's adding to the particle load indoors.
Well, let me ask you, just so the heated surfaces attract particulate?
I think it's a combination of things. They attract it, and they somewhat change it, which is another interesting thing I learned during this conference. How particles change when they go from outdoors to indoors. They actually change quite a bit, and I thought that was interesting information, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we get into the next presentation, or a couple down the road.
What were your takeaways from the next presentation that dealt with airborne allergens and smoke?
Okay, Dr. Lin Hi Roman is professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, and she did talk about indoor sources of airborne allergens and smoke. And I had a couple of interesting takeaways from that. One is combustion and particulate microns. The particulate microns from combustion are oftentimes, a lot of them are submicron particles, so they're in that kind of ultra-fine range. And it actually was interesting that today I was, it's kind of cold up here on the mountain, so we fired up the old wood burner here, which I try not to use too much because I know it's not good for my indoor air quality. But I'm on the mountain here. It's about 3 below zero today. Well, today we're probably up around, we got up to about 10 today. And, we needed a little extra heat. So you fire that up, and when you do, you get a lot of small particles. But I have this little particle counter on my desk called SPEC. And we talked actually about that a little bit at the show, at the conference as well. And the peak did go up. It didn't go up as much as I expected, and I think in part that might be the fact that a lot of those particles are ultrafines, and it's just not capturing that, but it definitely goes up, and it's interesting to watch how particles change as different activities occur. Other sources she mentioned that were well studied were cigarettes, incense, and again, wood combustion. So those have been studied to some degree, but there are combustion sources that need more study. And one of the big ones that was discussed is cooking. We know that grilling and burning cause the highest amounts of particulate matter. We know that natural gas stoves and ovens emit mostly ultrafine particles, and that e-cigarettes can have some ultrafine particles as well. But the size and the evaporative rates depend on dilution. So interesting additional topics that I don't think we always think about is the particulate from cooking, from natural gas stoves, and from ovens, etc. And then she also mentioned that the persistence of these is not clear, and there's a lot of issues with respect to neighbors and infiltration, and then those issues haven't been really well studied. We'll talk more about that as we go along. She also mentioned that how, that your proximity to the area or the source is very much important. Is very important with respect to the level of exposure that you'll get. That once you're outside of the source by about a meter, the exposure seems to go down, but when you're right within that meter, it could be 10 to 20 times as high, and as with a well-mixed environment. She also mentioned some other indoor sources of airborne allergens. Of course, we know about people, dogs, cats, but skin cells and the bacteria from skin cells. Talked a little bit about house dust, damp surfaces, and how Aspergillus penicillium tend to be higher indoors. I think most of our listeners are aware of that. How allergen sizes vary tremendously. Talked about the different allergen sizes, and talked a little bit about vacuuming. Essentially, that normal vacuuming is going to give you about a 2 to 5 time increase in fine PM concentrations. Exception being if you have a well-sealed, HEPA-filtered vacuum cleaner where it's not as bad. You're still going to get some elevation, but not as bad. And the things she said we need more study on are the factors affecting emission rates and of bacteria and fungi, which I found interesting. So we don't really know what airflow, vibration, I thought about water activity and mentioned that as well. We don't know how those affect the emission rate of these different allergens and airborne particulates that are biological in nature. And then her final thought was that homes that are tightly sealed and your source emissions are going to build up, and we haven't done any, a great deal of study on how much that affects the amount of particulate in the indoor environment, and also higher humidity rates and what elevated humidity does with respect to particulate, but also when we tighten up buildings, what that does with respect to humidity rates. So those were a couple of takeaways from that particular presentation.
Joe, there was a couple of texts. There was a comment and a question. Let's deal with the question first. Are any of the presentations going to be available to the public, either in a recording or written or via computer form?
Yes, that was asked, and David Butler asked that we give him about 1 to 2 weeks, and all of the presentations will be available through the National Academy of Sciences website. And we'll get that link out. I put it out with the last 3 show announcements, but we'll get that link out again as well. So they will be available, and it's excellent information. I encourage people to get them.
Then we have a listener comment, on heaters having an electromagnetic field that can attract dust and then burn the dust off, and I guess that's where some of the change takes place in the particles and the characteristics. What was the next presentation, and what were your takeaways from that one?
Okay, the next one was Brandon Bohr, and we've had Brandon on the show. Dr. Bohr, he was, if I recall correctly, he came on with Rich Coursey, and I got to say thanks again to Rich. Dr. Coursey down at the University of Texas, Austin there. Well, he's been such a great friend to the show, and he's really, we got the Hall of Fame last month there, Cliff, but really Rich Coursey belongs in that Hall of Fame. He is taught and and mentored so many of these young indoor air quality guys. And this is just another example of one that he's worked with and done such a great job with. His presentation.
A cloud of dust.
Yeah.
Or suspension in indoor environments.
Right. And Brandon talked about a good bit about resuspension. He's done a lot of research on resuspension of particles, and what I found interesting that he talked about was, one that we're all familiar with if you've done any particle measurements in a home, that walking and activity in the home resuspends particles, and in my experience the larger particles, and he confirmed that, and that we really don't have good information on like the exposure to particles for an infant, for instance, near the floor. And I think it was him that had the video of a little robot, I think the Japanese built to simulate a baby, and they had it crawling across different types of carpet, and they measured the particulate that was being generated just by the baby crawling. The other thing I thought he mentioned on our show but brought up again was the sleep microenvironment. So what we're exposed to while we're sleeping, and that was interesting. I was talking to a couple of the presenters, because I think it was Bill Fisk who mentioned that the studies on the use of portable high efficiency air cleaners indicate that they really don't help that much with allergy and asthma. At least by themselves. We later clarified that maybe in combination with other things they would help more. But I think part of the reasoning was that a lot of the particulate that's generated, especially while sleeping, is right there within, it's in the bed, it's under the covers. It's when you're rolling on the bed, when you turn over from side to side, there's a lot of particulate generation. It reminds me of going to look at a well-known college I won't mention the name here. I did an investigation at, and they were getting ready to remodel the dorms, and there were three very knowledgeable indoor air quality investigators that went along for a walk there, and they were talking about ventilation and talking about humidity and etc. And my first thought when I walked in these rooms was, how often do you change these mattresses? Because they looked horrible, Cliff. I mean, I wouldn't want to sleep in that, and they're paying $30,000, $40,000 a year to go to this well-known Ivy League type school, and this is the type of thing I think some of us miss. Is a third of our day, 8 hours a day, is spent in that bed. There's a lot of exposure in that bed. One of the best things you can do for your indoor environment is to keep that area clean, and to get a new mattress from time to time, and to use good vacuuming technique and washing technique on those things. And I think Brandon really helped to drive that home in my mind, and talked about the sleep microenvironment. He also talked about occupant clothing, and when that came up, Dr. Kipen, who's MD, medical doctor, mentioned that they have some good studies and some good information now coming in on cleaners. And I thought about you when this came up, and the development of allergy and asthma. I can't remember if it was one or both. I know asthma was part of it in people who clean for a living. And so I'm going to get Dr. Kipen. He agreed to come on the show and talk about that a little bit. I look forward to doing that down the road. The other thing is Brandon discussed the difference between multi-layer and monolayer particulate. And we really don't know that much about the difference in particulate emissions or particulate exposure between these multi-layer and monolayer types of particle loads. And that made me think about cleaning the air ducts in your home, and the EPA document from back in 1991, should you have the air ducts in your home cleaned? And when you think about it, when you look at mechanical systems, sometimes they have like a thin monolayer of particulate, but other times they've got a real thick layer of particulate in there. And I thought him talking about a multi-layer versus a monolayer was important, in that we don't really know how that affects the particle levels, and we need more information on that. He also mentioned we need good information on adhesion of particles, and that again makes me think about mechanical systems. I was always I know the early studies back in the late 80s and early 90s said that when we clean mechanical systems, we sometimes increase the particle level in homes, and that maybe that's because of the adhesion, that maybe we should leave them alone because that particulate is adhered to the ductwork, etc. So interesting stuff. They really don't have much on it, but I suspect in the future they'll be doing more research on that. And I think we better move on, Cliff, because I'm going to run out of time here. I know it. Let's go to Jeff Siegel. Let me make sure where we're at here. Yeah, I've got the Jeff Siegel notes in front of me. Another fascinating guy we've had on the show, came out of the UT group as well, and he was talking about particle size and concentration. And let's see if I can get to that. Oh yeah, I did skip Glenn Morrison. We'll get back to Glenn in a moment. So Jeff was talking about the dynamics of particle size and concentrations indoor. And he did a building science perspective. Jeff likes the building science world, and Dr. Siegel's an interesting guy, and he brought up some interesting points. He talked about, first of all, the fact that buildings have large surface areas, and there's a large variation in the measured and modeled deposition rates. So we don't have good models on how particles are deposited in buildings, and whether they're localized or they're spread out evenly or any of that stuff. It's really difficult to say. And then he also mentioned resuspension of particles, and again, that monolayer versus the multi-layer deposits on hard surfaces, and we don't really know how that affects the resuspension. And then he mentioned HVAC systems, and that the fact that forced air systems are very common. They're ubiquitous in the States. So we went on to talk a little bit about filtration and how filtration could be a big part of the answer to making to helping indoor environments have fewer particles. But that if we're going to do that, we have to make sure that those filters are properly sealed, properly sized. We use the right type of filters. He also mentioned that the components within the system act as a sink for particles, and that we need really, and this is what I know Brian Baker's listening, and I kept thinking when they're making these statements, we have some of this information out there. We got to get it in the hands of the right people. One of the things he mentioned that we need good runtime measurements on mechanical systems, because we don't know how often systems run within the built environment. Are they running 10%, 20%, 30% of the time? That data is coming. There's some good information on that, and I wanted to bring that up because I know Brian's listening. He also talked about heterogeneity and the importance for exposure. And again, that air cleaner study came up, and that it did a good job of helping people with cardiovascular related health effects, or I don't know if they had the specific health effects, but they studied how it would assist with cardiovascular, but it didn't seem to help much with the allergen and asthma related effects. But cardiovascular was a big focus of this conference, because we know PM 2.5 causes a lot of cardiovascular related issues. So he said the knowledge gaps were the HVAC runtime. He thinks we may be assuming higher runtimes than are actually occurring. He talked about ventilation dynamics and how they affect particulate. And I think the biggest point I want to bring up with Dr. Jeff Siegel, was he talked a lot about these unseen surfaces and spaces, which I don't know that all the researchers were aware of all the different unseen surfaces and spaces that add to or affect the particle levels within homes. So attics, crawl spaces, plenums above ceilings, wall cavities, pipe chases, electrical chases, all of those things are unseen surfaces and spaces that affect our indoor environment and the particles in there. And I thought it was a very interesting presentation. Jeff is always fascinating. Let's go to halftime, Cliff. When we come back, we're going to go back to Glenn Morrison. For some reason, I had them out of order. And thanks to our newest sponsor, Particles Plus. Particles Plus engineers and manufactures feature-rich particle counters, air quality monitoring instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. Learn more at www.particlesplus.com. indoorplus.com. Count on us.
The Indoor Air Quality Association, a nonprofit, multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Visit them at iaqa.org. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions. We use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com.
Legends Environmental Insurance Services, the experts in insurance for environmental consultants and contractors for over 20 years. Check them out at legends-enviro.com.
And of course, our marquee sponsors, John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at johndon.com.
CleanFacts, the #1 information source for cleaning and restoration professionals. Check them out at cleanfacts.com.
IAQ.net and Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at IAQ.net. Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their products or services.
Okay, we're back with the second half of our review of the workshop that took place just this week, actually, at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I kind of skipped over Dr. Glenn Morrison. I had them out of order. So the second session was on particulate dynamics and chemistry. And this was Rich Corsi. He was the moderator for that. And then Glenn Morrison came on first. I jumped over to Jeff Siegel. But Glenn talked about indoor chemistry and aerosols. And this was a really fascinating session. And then the third session was Charlie Weschler, who it was someone in the audience mentioned, said this was like 3 graduate courses in post-grad school. I mean, it was just unbelievable the amount of information they did. And these were only 20-minute presentations, but a lot of interesting information. So let's go to Glenn. Glenn was talking about he talked a lot about oxidation and secondary organic aerosols. And when Glenn and Charlie talked about what happens to particles when they enter a building, and they were primarily talking about particles coming from the outside into a building, and how much change occurs to that particle when it goes inside. And that change occurs as the result oftentimes of oxidation, and we get these secondary organic aerosols. So the indoor precursors of secondary organic aerosols include the terpenes, ozone, and nitrate radicals, so NO3. And it was very interesting when they talked about these because, you don't think about a particle going from outside to inside and then changing, and they do. And they're starting to have some good advances in the measurement of these types of particles, especially the secondary particles that occur and the secondary organic aerosols that occur. They're getting better at modeling this, and they're learning more about some of the reactive oxygen species. And we hear a lot about these things when in the restoration world, when people were using ozone or the hydroxyl radicals and so on. And a big part of the impression I got was that we really don't understand this very well, but we're making progress, and we're learning more about how these different reactive oxygen species affect the particles when they are in the indoor environment. And he talked about how there are knowledge gaps, and these knowledge gaps are things that we still have to fill in. And at this point, it was kind of tough to follow at times because it just got so detailed with respect to the chemical changes that occur to these particles, and then the secondary particles or the secondary aerosols that are created when these reactions occur. And I just kept thinking of what one of our guests said about the hydroxyl radicals and the hydroxyl generators and the ozone generators, that we're kind of playing chemist without really knowing what we're doing. And that always worries me that when we start using these things. So I thought that was a great way to start the session. Then I talked about what Dr. Siegel talked about, and that was the dynamics of particle size and concentrations indoor. And the last one was the one that was really tough to follow, but I did my best. Charlie Weschler, Dr. Weschler, who we were working on getting on the show, talked about the composition of indoor particulate matter, including the influence of SVOC partitioning. Okay, so these are semi-volatile organic compounds, and he was talking about partitioning. So Charlie mentioned first, went back through the size ranges. The ultrafines were 0.1 micrometers and less. The fine particles were 2.5 down to that 0.1, and the coarse were greater than 2.5. He talked again about the outdoor versus indoor sources, and talked about the fact that a lot of the particles are organic carbon particles. I think he said they were about 60% in the indoor environment, and that there were some emerging topics. So, for instance, the processes that change the chemical composition of outdoor particles changes significantly when it comes indoors. The outdoor particulate matter acquires these SVOCs when indoors, and I believe that's what he referred to as partitioning. I've got to go back and review that again once the slides come out. He also mentioned that we shed the entire outer layer of our skin every 2 to 4 weeks, and that it doesn't just come off as necessarily skin cells, that again, we have this partitioning that occurs, and that there were phase states of indoor particulate matter, which he described as liquid, semi-solid, and glassy, and that we have many holes in the knowledge about the chemical composition of indoor particulate matter because of all these things. Then he also mentioned a term I wasn't familiar with. I'm sure many listeners are. He called it gray dust. And this is one example he gave was from ultrasonic humidifiers, and that when you use an ultrasonic humidifier, you get this kind of gray dust, I guess, that's left behind. And I thought about a recent project I was on where they weren't really using the humidifier, and you got all that kind of white granular material that was left behind, the minerals, etc., that were in the water. And they talked about the need for using either deionized water or purified water. But even when you did that, you got this gray dust as the result of using these types of humidifiers. So all very interesting information. Again, they were all PhDs, but even the other the PhDs were kind of like, whoa, that one went over our head a little bit. But it was just fascinating and showed us how much we don't know, I guess, is the best way. He also, a couple of people mentioned how ozone just doesn't do much of anything with respect to particulate, and that it's oversold for, there's a lot of claims made that just can't be verified. So that was a good one. Cliff?
Okay. Well, what I was going to suggest is, we don't have a whole lot of time. We have a lot of presentations left. You want to go through each one, and would you prefer to have 1 point per presentation? The one
let's get a
takeaway
couple key points from each one. Let's go over to the next one. That's Barbara Turpin, and this session was on exposure levels and characterization. That was moderated by Terry Brennan. Dr. Turpin is at the Environmental Sciences and Engineering, Professor of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at North Carolina Gilling School of Global Public Health. And she was talking about exposure characterization and how it provides insights into sources and transformations. And she said that indoor generated particulate matter is largely organic, and I had mentioned earlier, I think 50 or 60%. She said about 70% of the organic particulate matter is indoors. And then she talked about increased respiratory hospital admissions once we got to about 10 micrograms. And she mentioned a little bit about VOCs as well, and we really don't know very well what types of VOCs are indoors, and really we just don't have a great knowledge on how many different types of VOCs are indoors, and they are definitely much higher than outdoors, which made me think about the Prism Labs folks and Alice DeLea and a lot of the work they're doing on indoor volatile organic compounds. I think it'd be great to see them get together. So those were some key points from there. I'll keep them short from here, Cliff.
Okay.
How about we go to Roy Harrison next? Some determinants of indoor concentrations and exposures to particulate matter. He came to us via web from the Queen Elizabeth Birmingham. He's the Queen Elizabeth Birmingham Centenary Professor of Environmental Health at the University of Birmingham. And he talked to us a little bit about how particles from, they have a couple of buildings they were studying, and one was an unoccupied building. Now, in that building, about 75% of the indoor particles came from outside. So that was, pretty close to what the others had been saying, although this was an unoccupied building. And then he talked about the fact that that in his research at least, it takes about 20 minutes, and it again depends on the type of building, how tight the building is, the building envelope, for the outdoor particles to get indoors. And then the unresolved questions he mentioned were the differential toxicity of particles from different sources, with different composition, that we need to learn more about that, and that as the particles from food, cooking, etc., or are the particles from food, cooking, etc., as toxic as the outdoor pollutant mixture. What was interesting is all of them were pretty much concerned about the outdoor particles that come inside, because we know that outdoor PM 2.5 causes these respiratory and cardiovascular issues. I thought there would be more emphasis on the particles that were, indoor, that were coming from indoor sources, but they were actually more worried about the particles coming from outdoor sources, and maybe that's just the impression I got. But he did ask about whether or not the particles from cooking were as problematic as those from outside, and I thought that was an interesting presentation. All right. Next, we had session, let's see, this is going to be session 4, exposure mitigation. All right. Now, this was good, and this was moderated by Tina Raponen out of the University of Cincinnati. And the first guy up was Bill Fisk.
Socioeconomic determination of indoor particulate matter exposure, understanding sources, structures, and settings by Gary Adamowicz.
Yeah, Adamowicz. Excellent. Very interesting presentation by Gary. He is a guy that works more with multifamily and lower socioeconomic types of indoor environments. So he's out of Harvard, I believe, and the Harvard School of Public Health, and talked about the socioeconomic determinants of indoor PM and did more of a multi-level view of the determinants. So he talked about how the neighborhood, the building, and the household all affected the types of particles within that building. And then he talked also about the sources that, there were slightly different sources from each of these. So, for instance, environmental tobacco smoke was more of an issue in those types of settings, cooking, he talked about the structures and the problems with getting the structures fixed in many cases. He also talked about more of a holistic approach, and mentioned the American Housing Survey, and that building energy, the intersection between building energy retrofits and health. And he talked a little bit about that and the fact that we just don't know for certain how that's going to, what that intersection is going to be like. That's going to be interesting to find. And that PM 2.5, nicotine at the highest levels in the winter, highest levels were also in disabled units. So he talked a little bit about, I don't know if it necessarily was PM 2.5, but nicotine, and how in either disabled or elderly units, they found very high levels in those types of units. And that's, not always, we don't always think about the difference in not just the neighborhood, the building, and the particular occupants in that building, but then you've got different types of occupants. You've got the elderly, you've got the young, you've got, those in between. And he talked a lot about those types of things and some public housing related aspects. So very interesting presentation by Gary.
Bill Fisk, indoor particulate.
Yeah, Bill talked about particulate. I guess the big takeaway for me there was he talked about filtration. I mean, he's very knowledgeable on filtration and fibrous filtration, and then talked a lot about the promise, but also the misunderstandings about electrostatic technologies. And I guess the big takeaway for me there was that the removal efficiency of these, the removal efficiencies of these filters decreases pretty quickly. He said that charged filters rapidly lose their efficiency. I thought that was an interesting takeaway from there. He also was the one that mentioned that the standalone filters had not really shown any benefit with respect to asthma and allergy, but then when we talked about it a little bit later, he said, well, they could show more of an effect if it was combined with other types of intervention, like more frequent washing of bedding, HEPA vacuuming, etc., and that really hadn't been studied very well, and that there were excellent health benefits of filtration, and filtration sometimes improves health outcomes in subjects with allergy and asthma, but it definitely improves the outcomes in those in cardiovascular outcomes. So he wasn't saying we shouldn't use filtration. He was, a big filtration guy, but still not sure about the standalone filtration with respect to asthma and allergy. But he did feel that, and that study showed that it does help with cardiovascular. Sergey Grinspun, he's with the University of Cincinnati. Methods and approaches for controlling exposure, and this was another one that was interesting in that I'm not that familiar, and I think it's one of those that a lot of people aren't terribly familiar with things like unipolar ion emission, and he did talk a lot about ozone generators as well, and that they do not clean the air. He talked about the thermal inactivation of aerosolized spores, and got into the temperatures necessary. He was talking about temperatures on the order of 300 degrees centigrade. I did get a chance to talk to him after the show, or after the presentation, and mentioned that this was a hot topic with the restoration industry, that there was actually a patent on using heat in buildings, and that they would be very interested in the type of information that he had. And I guess the big takeaway from there was that he wasn't convinced that using heat at the levels that we typically see, when they're pasteurizing buildings, would do much with respect to the mold spores and bacterial spores. So the spores were more hardy, and that would be difficult. He wasn't really familiar with the technology, but I look forward to getting him on the show to discuss that in the future.
Hey, Joe, I have an idea, but let me just run it by you.
Yes, sir.
We're getting low on time. If you do the blog this week, for presentations that we don't have the opportunity to discuss, you can just add your notes.
Yeah, I can do that. Let me just run down the rest of the list here real quick, okay? Because I got Brett Singer was next. Let's see, air sealing was more effective for ultrafine particles when they did air sealing. Ryan Allen, I talked about, he was with Simon Fraser University. Dr. Allen talked about PM and health and cardiovascular health. He studied about 500 non-smoking houses, and the outdoor particulate matter accounted for about 80% in his study of the indoor PM. And the hottest topic with health is particulate matter and cardiovascular again. So he was, again, letting us know that was the topic with respect to particulate matter, was the cardiovascular, and that's what a lot of people were looking at, because that's where the biggest health effects are. Although we know there are others, and we're not downplaying the others, but that was a big part of what his presentation was on. And that, I guess the most interesting part on that was that even at lower levels of PM 2.5, the effects are still occurring, these cardiovascular effects. So even at lower levels of PM2.5, and that the curve is the steepest at the low end of that distribution. So I thought that was interesting. Presentation from Dr. Allen. And he also talked about how particles can enter the body different ways, that, you have influence, of course, with the lungs, and then you have spillover, and then the autonomic nervous system and the blood vessels, and then particles directly entering the bloodstream. So a very interesting presentation. He actually, I've probably got more notes from his presentation than any other. Let's move over to David Rich with the University of Rochester. And David talked about ambient PM and adverse birth outcomes, another very interesting presentation, and talked about the studies on premature birth and fetal growth and restrictions on fetal growth and pregnancy complications. And he talked about how particulate is, how they're studying the effects of particulate on these different issues, which is something I never really thought about, and how there appears to be, and they're still, of course, working on these things, maybe some association between the particle levels and these birth outcomes. And I thought that was very interesting. So he pointed out one study where after a Utah Valley steel mill closed, the preterm births dropped when the steel mill closed. And they've got a couple other good, interesting studies on that. The next one was Mark Weisskopf, and this one I really wanted to get to today because he, again, had a little different take on particles and the health effects related to particles. He was talking about neurological and psychiatric disorders and how indoor particulate may affect those. And, this particulate matter can reach the brain, and it can do so through the respiratory tract or directly through the olfactory. And I thought that was an interesting take. I know others had texted me on that, and were very interested in what he was talking about. He also mentioned some studies on particulate matter and autism, and whether or not particulate matter may be affecting autism. And there have been some animal studies on that. So I look forward to getting him on to discuss that in a little more detail as well. And neurological disease in general, things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. He said there's a suggested association with particulate matter with respect to these neurological diseases, which I don't think many of us thought about in the past, Cliff. We're making some progress. Let me just kind of go over the last session here. Interventions and risk communication. And I think I can summarize the three presentations pretty quickly here. We had Dr. George Gray, Dr. Bill Hallman, and Dr. Leanne Culler, who discussed intervention and risk communication. And the whole time I was thinking about the show we did with Dr. Sandman out of Yale, Cliff, if you remember that show, and risk communication related issues. And they were talking about what we don't know with respect to the challenges in communicating the particulate matter risk. And those of us out in the field know how difficult it is to communicate, to people about things they can't see, they can't feel, they can't taste. And why is that important? And then the challenges with respect to, I talked about a low-cost sensor, the peak we've got, or the little sensor we talked about from Create Labs at CMU. And low cost to whom, I guess, was the question. If you're getting a $250 tax rebate, are you going to spend $200 on this low-cost particle sensor? Well, I thought that was a good point, that how do we, even if we learn all this information and we, learn without a doubt how particulate matter affects health, how do we communicate that to the people who need the information in a way that's going to get them to change behaviors? And basically the takeaway for me was that's going to be really, really hard. And I talked to Terry Brennan a little bit about this after the conference, and it's going to be a tough challenge to get people to recognize that particulate matter in their homes is an important issue, and that one that they should be really paying closer attention to. They used radon a lot to kind of help illustrate how difficult it can be. With radon, it was very difficult to get people to test their homes for radon. Even when they gave away the radon test kits, it was very difficult to get people to use them. And they went over the different factors that make this such a challenge. But it's not without hope. And the thing you have to do is you have to start with, and this was the last presentation by Dr. Kohler. She talked about, the fact that we've got to get first a baseline of information. I've got so many notes from these 3 presentations. They were just excellent. We're going to have to get a couple of them on the show, but we need a baseline of information. And that, we have to keep in mind, those listening to this show who are in this indoor environmental quality or disaster restoration world, we're a privileged group, that only about 29% of adults 25 years and older have a 4-year degree. About 43% live in rental properties, that about 15% are living in poverty. And a lot of times these are the people that need this information, but how do we get it to them in a way where they're going to use it? So how do we communicate to who? What are we going to say? Through what channel? With what effect? And I found that a great way to end the presentation. I couldn't decide if that should have been the first thing or the last thing in this conference, because, it really made you think about all this different information we're gathering, and we're learning more about the indoor environment and particles in the indoor environment. But how do we take that information and make a difference in people's lives? Well, the first thing we've got to do is learn the answers to some of these questions with respect to, who, what they think about it now, how we're going to communicate it to them, through what channels. And I thought, I can't wait till we get Dr. Hallman on the show, because, he mentioned something about, I think it was him, it might have been Dr. Culler, and I kind of want to end with this. We're using the terminology coarse particles, fine particles, ultrafine particles. Well, if you think about it, and you don't have any idea of what particulate matter is or whatever, and you tell somebody, we're worried about fine particles in your home, they're going to look at you like, well, they're fine. What's wrong with them? They're fine particles. They're probably good particles, and it's the way we present this is going to have to be really well thought out, and it's going to have to be done in a way where we can actually get some buy-in from the people who need to, who need the information that we're gathering. Cliff?
Yeah, a couple things, Joe. This event that you went to, is this going to be an annual workshop?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not sure. I know the next step is they're going to put, the Institute of Medicine put out the Damp Buildings and Health back in like 2005. As I understand it, they're going to put together a paper that will present all this information for people, and then there are going to be recommendations, and this is going to help guide EPA in how they tackle this issue as time goes on. I don't think it will be an annual thing, though.
All right, good enough. That was just my final question.
You want to bring Pete in and say hello?
Sure.
Oh. Hello, Pete. There you go. Hey, Pete.
Hey guys, how you doing? I sorry I couldn't call in earlier. I had a conflict on one of my conference calls. It was on Central Time, and I was on Eastern Time, so it overlapped, and I couldn't jump off the call early. But I've been on for about 10 minutes. I've been hearing the last little thing you've been talking about, and but anyway, I glad I at least got a chance to kind of call in. So, how'd the show go?
Well, Pete, here's the problem. I tried to put, a day and a half, about 12 hours of excellent presentations into an hour, and that's always a challenge. But I told Cliff I'll do the blog this week. We'll put the blog together and try and get this information in a nice, concise manner out to the listeners. But it was a very interesting very, very interesting workshop. A lot of very intelligent people there, and a lot of good questions. Some answers, not as many as I think we would like. And I think the last part is probably the most important. We're going to get all this information, but then how do we get it to where it matters and where people will act on it? And I was talking to a friend of yours and ours, Terry Brennan, after the workshop, and
you tell me Terry Brennan's great. I mean, he's been to every summer camp from summer camp 1. I don't think he's missed one, and he presented one year as one of the featured speakers too. It's been a while. He's really great, man. I'm glad you got to spend some quality time with Terry. He's a good guy.
Yeah, and he's got a builder's background and a building science background, and I don't know. I kind of think you're going to have to somehow get this information built into code or renovation requirements or international property maintenance or something like that. I just don't see the bulk of the people out there, either being able to afford to make some of these changes or being aware enough of how important it is to make them. Although there are some, I think, that they can do pretty easily, and I think we're going to have to.
Have you guys ever interviewed Terry on the show?
Oh yeah, and he'll be back. He'll be back. I'm trying to get him for a keynote at our conference this year. I think we made great progress on that as well. But
I got a couple of thoughts based on not just what I heard, but I knew and understood from reading the show notice and what you all doing with the intent of the show. So I got a couple of thoughts on that to share. I mean, the first thing is what you want to do to capture all this information. I think is really, really important. But trying to put all those sessions into a 1-hour show. Back in the neighborhood where I grew up, we talked about that was like trying to put 2 pounds of poop in a 1 pound bag. You can make it fit, but the bottom falls out. But I have always advocated for years in all of my association activities is that a lot of these events that get put on at the associations are one-time only events, and you don't always have access to the proceedings. But that the benefit of belonging to something, which whether it's a member of a group or even, loyal readers of your show, and people will always, check out the blogs, is that it's important that a company gets that information and gets passed on to people in their organization. So in the context of the show, how does that transcend? Well, essentially what you've done, Joe, is you've kind of been like a scout out there going to this program, dissecting the information, trying to make it relevant to the audience. And granted, it's probably too much to cover in the show, but you can really detail it in the blog, get it out to the people. Maybe you do a follow-up show. And, I think that's an important part of the educational process, if you would. And particularly with your show, you guys have a CEC component that some of the different people can get. And, this is kind of the technical area with a lot of the big issues. So in my mind, I think that's really good work. And attaboy for Radio Joe. And, and I think it's something that the listeners and the people out there, should keep in mind, when they leverage, belonging to REA, IEQA, ASHRAE, AIHA, whatever group it is, go get that information. Have someone there. Doesn't have to just be the owner. And when they come back, they need to do a brain dump and, do a 1-hour meeting, like kind of what you're doing. Give all the key points back to everyone else from the company so that they're up to date on what the latest information is and they're on the same page. You don't have one project manager saying this and the lady in the office talking to customers saying this and that. You kind of share the wealth. And, for whatever that's worth, if you put a couple of the watchdog talking points, maybe you put that at the end of the blog. I think that is something that people should take under consideration. So anyway, sorry I missed the show. I did want to try to call in. And anyway, I'm glad it went well.
Yeah, we always appreciate having you check in, Pete. And, I think the National Academy is going to put out a paper, but it's going to be something that I don't know how many people will take the time to read through the whole paper. It's going to be a big paper, as I understand it. So I think having some quick summary of it for people, and I agree, I think you bring up a good point that needs to get put out to all the troops, not just the owner or the top supervisor, so that everybody's on the same page. And the other nice thing is that this is something they can use in their everyday, in their homes every day. Where there are certain things that we need to be aware of. That particulate matter is obviously a big issue. It's they wouldn't have put all the time and money and effort into putting this program together if they didn't have solid information that shows that this is a health concern that we should be paying attention to, and that it needs to have a light shone on it. We got to shine the light on this, and I was very happy to be a part of it. Well, Cliff, any final thoughts before we sign off here?
No, I'm done.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. We appreciate everybody being here. We appreciate EPA putting together this and sponsoring this workshop. And, of course, the National Academy did a great job there. Everybody was very, very welcoming, and I thought it was well done. And if you got a chance to join it live, I think you really saw some great speakers. And my goal is now, Cliff, to make sure that the other half that we haven't had on, we're going to get on here at some point, and we'll go over each of these in a lot more detail when we do get these specific speakers on. But in the meantime, we got the word out, and I think we helped to spread the word a little bit on particulate matter and why it's important. So this is Radio Joe saying thanks to our sponsors, of course, to my co-host, the Z-Man, to Pete, the Restoration Industries Global Watchdog, Pete Consigli, to my engineer, John, you got to have faith, and most importantly, our growing group of loyal. Well, I'll tell you what, Don Lowe's have been excellent here so far this year. Keep them coming, folks, and we'll see you next week. We've got a great episode lined up for next week. I don't have it in front of me here, but I know, what do we got on that schedule, John? Maybe I don't have it on there yet. All right. Well, I'll get out the show announcement soon, and we'll all look forward to seeing everyone again here next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio.
This has been another IAQ Radio production.